So no, is my mic open? Yes. Okay, so for those of you joining the event without prior knowledge of our organisation, we're the Leicester branch of a charity called the Dialogue Society, which is a registered charity in the UK and has been operating nationwide for over 20 years. Our main aim is advancing social cohesion by connecting communities, empowering people to engage and contribute to the development ideas through dialogue. We do this through community dinners, discussion forums, courses, scriptural reading, picnics, and so much more, allowing people to venture across boundaries and religion, culture, and social class, obviously. If you would like any further information regarding what we do and our work and projects, we do have social media accounts, or feel free to get in contact with us through email that we will be putting in the chat section in a bit. For England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, Leicester is a relatively high crime city, with the most common crimes in Leicester being violence and sexual offences. Unfortunately, the offences of the nature disproportionately impact women and girls. Our panel's aim is to facilitate a dialogue on how to best empower the women and girls of Leicester in the face of such crimes. We have a very diverse panel and an open question and answer session at the end, as I said. So we will be featuring a couple of people to give us their knowledge and explain their work and what they have been doing, and obviously things like that. So we've got 3 key speakers for our panel. Our panel. 3 key speakers from our panel series. Yeah, so now we've got 3 key speakers from our panel series. Our panel, which is obviously Women Empowerment in High Crime Cities, Leicester Case, which is why we're here today. We will explore the dangers and challenges for women and girls in different areas of the community in high crime cities, and giving examples from Leicester. We'll be unpacking this topic together and with our panel speakers, and the audience will allow us to build a safe and secure community for the women. Please do feel free to put your questions through the Zoom chat or YouTube chat, depending on where you're connecting from. Without further delay, I will pass the mic on to our first panelist of the afternoon, Dr. Emma Sleath. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname right. So Dr. Emma is an associate professor in criminology at the University of Leicester and is currently leading a project called Empower, working with organisations across Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire and Northamptonshire. Have I got all of those right, Emma? Yeah. To strengthen responses to violence against women and girls. Her main research focuses on criminal justice responses to victims of sexual and domestic violence and survivor-focused research to improve the way in which services are delivered. So now I'll be passing the mic on to Emma. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I am just going to hopefully share my screen and for this to work. We had a few technical glitches earlier, so does that look right or not right? Is that showing properly?
Yeah, we can see your PowerPoint, Emma.
Brilliant stuff. Well, that's a great start, isn't it? The technology is not getting in our way anyway. So thanks very much for that introduction. Thanks very much for the Dialogue Society for inviting me to come along. So I think that the introduction really set the scene for my talk in the context of potentially a high crime city. We're obviously going to need to respond to victimisation. So my talk really focuses on what we can do to empower women after victimisation, and how can we, as a community, as organisations, really support those women to recover and, as I said, feel empowered post-victimisation. So I'm going to be drawing on 4 projects that I've been working on in recent years. The first of all is, as Beth said, is the Empower project. This is very much a network of organisations who are already doing great work to support and provide care for survivors of violence against women and girls. And we've been working together to really unpick some of the issues that they're experiencing around things like how can we help or support survivors to best engage in criminal justice system processes. How can we as organisations work together in a more cohesive and smooth way to really then provide that care and support for survivors in a better way. So that's the first bit of research that I'm going to be drawing on. The second project was called JICSAV, and this it really explored the way in which survivors experienced the pandemic, how that affected their experiences of criminal justice processes, and potentially also what opportunities we received from the way in which the pandemic changed the way in which services were delivered to survivors. Then the final project I'll be drawing on is the MESARC project. I live in a world full of acronyms for the projects that I work on. I don't know why that is, but it just seems to have worked out that way. And this is a national project that is evaluating the work of sexual assault referral centres. And if you don't know what one of those is, I will talk about that in just a moment. So these have been research projects that have been funded by research councils. So just to say thank you to them for funding our research. The final little picture that's on this front slide is the We Are Voices work, and I'll talk about that on the last slide in a bit more detail, but that's about some work I've been doing recently to help support the setting up of a lived experience group of sexual violence survivors to shape the way in which services are delivered in this region. So hopefully that's moved on. Just to set some of the scene, I think probably Beth already gave a really good introduction in relation to this. Much of my work at the minute really does focus on violence against women and girls, and previously very much on sexual violence. And I just really wanted to recognise that that's not necessarily a topic that everyone finds comfortable about recognising and talking about that. But I think a lot of my work is about trying to shine a light on that, reducing stigma, raising awareness around that this violence does happen in our communities. And so we do need to get to a place where we are more comfortable in talking about solutions to this particular forms of violence. So women experiencing victimisation is a fairly common experience. It's more common than we really would want, and that is something that occurs both in the UK as a whole, internationally, and I don't think Leicester, although it is a high crime city, is necessarily unusual in the way in which some of these forms of violence really occur in our communities. So looking at some of our Office for National Statistic data, this shows the kind of levels of prevalence we have around violence. So 1 in 2 women aged between 16 and 34 report experiencing harassment in the last year. In Leicestershire, there was the equivalence of domestic abuse at the rate of 20 cases per 1,000 people of the population. And that's not particularly a happy story to tell around women's experiences of the world more generally. But ultimately, much of my work really is around interacting and researching with female survivors And a common theme to that victimisation is that ultimately victimisation is a very disempowering experience for women. It affects their physical health, it affects their mental health, it affects their broader quality of life. It reduces well-being, it reduces things like their feelings of safety in the community. It can affect women financially, so thinking about things like if people need to take sick leave, they have lost earnings, if they need to leave their home because of domestic abuse, that can mean leaving with only what they can carry. So that kind of sets the scene for not necessarily a positive picture of the experiences of women in the world. But my next slide is really about how can we respond to that? How can we support and empower women after this very disempowering experience? And what I've kind of found across my different bits of research that we're doing in the ways that potentially can do that very well. So I could obviously talk, probably given my work, for hours about things that can support empowerment, but I focused really on three things that I think are really important to talk about. The first one is around experiencing violence can be an incredibly isolating experience for women, and particularly for women where we see intersections of characteristics, so being female, from a minority community. We know that things like experiencing violence, like domestic abuse, can be shaming, can be stigmatizing. So those are really broad barriers that we see around women seeking care and support. But that is frequently coupled with issues around women not knowing where they can actually help seek, where they can actually find support. So one of my key findings that I think gives a really good example of this is my work evaluating sexual assault referral centres. So many people in the broader community do not know that actually a SARC exists in our community, and that after experiencing specifically sexual violence, that they can access care and support from them. So if anyone's in the kind of local Leicester area, you may not have known the name of the SARC within Leicester, but we do have one. It's called Juniper Lodge. But people don't know about its existence, don't know that they can access care from Juniper Lodge, whether they have experienced recent or non-recent victimisation. They can access care there, whether they've reported to the police, whether they've decided not to report to the police, whether they are still unsure about whether they want to report to the police. And when you access care there, you can do things like opt for your forensic evidence to be stored by them, should you decide later to support a police investigation. And the key reason why I'm talking so much about SARCs is that they can really act as quite a good onward referral point. So even if you don't need direct care and support from the SARC themselves, they can signpost or refer you into lots of other care and support agencies, such as counselling, mental health services, substance misuse services, sexual health services. So it's a really good access point onto a care and support route that many people don't know about. And one of the things that MESARC evaluation as a whole has really found is that accessing SARCs is actually a positive experience for survivors, and that's not being accessed in as widely as possible as it could be. So my first thing about empowering people after victimisation is that more needs to be done about survivors knowing where they can access care. In much the same way, if you fell over and thought you'd broken your leg, you would know to go to an A&E to get an X-ray. It needs to be that kind of immediate in terms of our knowledge about where we can access that care and support. And finally, just to sum up this point, it was about one of our main worries around people not knowing about SARCs was this wasn't just something that happened that existed in people in the community. Also, professionals didn't know about the existence of SARC. So GPs were frequently identified as a professional group who didn't know what services SARCs could provide. And that's stopping that key route. So GPs might be disclosed to about victimisation, but they won't know to signpost people onto potentially SARC care. My second point about empowerment really overlaps a little bit with this first point, in that many women experience victimisation as something that takes choice away from them. So if we're going to support recovery, one of the things that we need to think about is how we can emphasise their choice in as much or as many aspects of their care as possible. There's lots of routes that survivors can take when seeking support. That could be engaging in criminal justice processes, like supporting a police investigation right the way up to court trials. It can mean accessing a range of different services, like I talked about before, like SARCs, like mental health services, like sexual health services. However, survivors need to know what those services are, but then also need to know enough about those services to make a choice as to whether this is the right thing for them at that right time. And one thing we know about survivors is that the idea that there is a one-size-fits-all for survivors just doesn't really hold true. So we need to facilitate survivors to make decisions that suit them. It may be that someone doesn't want to engage in criminal justice processes straight away. Maybe they want to do that later and report to the police later on and then support an investigation. So the key point here is about choice, about enabling survivors to choose the way in which they receive care. And that should focus on their choices rather than what we might want for them. And then this final point about bespoke care and support, about how they actually want to receive care. So this came up, I'm going to draw on an example specifically from our JICSAV project that really looked at the way in which services changed during the pandemic. And one thing that we knew is that anyone who works in a support organisation knows that normally that care and support is given in a very kind of traditional face-to-face way. But with the kind of advent of the pandemic, you might all remember, we all went to kind of remove that kind of face-to-face component, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic. So many of these care and support services actually shifted to delivering their care remotely, using things like Teams, using things like Zoom, using telephone care support. And that certainly didn't benefit everyone. There was a significant number of survivors who disengaged from services during that time because they didn't feel able to get the right care and support when it was delivered remotely. However, what we found was that there was still quite a number of survivors who really benefited from that care and support being delivered remotely. So some of the survivors that we talked to spoke about that engaging with care over the phone or online was much easier because they felt more relaxed. They felt that that distance between their support worker and themselves made it easier to talk about harder topics, that it didn't feel such a big deal to receive care over the phone in comparison to having to deal with that potential pressure of being face-to-face with someone. There was also things like practical benefits. So the ease of accessibility meant that people weren't having to travel to particular locations to access that care, that they could fit care in to things like lunch hours whilst they were also working. So that meant for this particular group of survivors, they very much preferred online services. So the point I'm trying to make here is, again, it's that idea that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for survivors. What suits one survivor doesn't necessarily suit a second survivor, even if they appear to have really very similar victimisation experiences. So how to solve that is probably the hardest thing to do. Lots of organisations are already offering really excellent care in Leicester, doing many of these things around choice, around bespoke care and support. But I think we perhaps need to talk more about how those services are funded and how those services are commissioned. So thinking about and we talk to people who actually commission these services. So when they tender out for funding for this care and support, that they facilitate that care and support to be delivered in as bespoke way or as individualized way as possible. And then within the organizations themselves, thinking about what small things can we do that are practical and feasible, that means that the care that we're offering is individualized to that particular survivor. So bringing it all together, I think we need to think about the things I've talked about, and for organisations to reflect on, you know, are they achieving some of these things? And like I said before, lots of the organisations in Leicester that we're working with through Empower are doing exactly this in the way in which that they are delivering care. But we need to think about things like raising awareness, making sure that clients are, that survivors are very clear about where they can access care, and then supporting them to make choices about their care. And my final point is really about thinking about lived experience. So the way in which services have been delivered for many, many years haven't always reflected the lived experiences of survivors. And what that means is that we collaborate with individuals who've experienced things like sexual violence, that have experienced victimization before, and use their experiences, both good and bad, to shape the way in which we deliver services in the future. And one of the bits of work that I've been working on over the last year is setting up an individual group called Voices. And this is a lived experience group of sexual violence survivors who are now going to be working alongside a partnership of sexual violence organisations in the Leicestershire region to make sure that we hear their lived experience, we hear their expertise by experience in the way in which the strategies, the policies, the approaches, the methods that those organisations deliver services in this area. So thinking about how we can do that to make sure that services as a whole really reflect lived experience and reflect the way in which people actually experience victimization. So that was the end of my talk. I'd really welcome anyone to get in touch if they want to. I popped my email address up there if anyone does want to drop me an email. And then if you want to learn anything else about my other projects, you're very welcome to access them on their websites there. You've got the one for Empower, the one for Mesarc, and the one for Jigsaw. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was a very valuable input. Personally, I really found the part about spreading awareness on how survivors can access help very important, because as you said, it's not as it's not a very common knowledge. Obviously, from the example that you also gave us, like people would know where to go if they had a broken arm, but in these cases, they're really far back regarding knowledge. Again, thank you so much. So moving on to our second panelists, these guys are Carl Martin and Tony Garrett. Yeah, so Mr. Martin and Miss Garrett. Carl and Tony are a part of New Features charity, which is a charity that works with women who are at risk of being sexually exploited. They support women in breaking the cycle of abuse, exploitation, poverty, and marginalization. However, unfortunately, there had been a complication this morning, so they're not able to join our event live anymore. However, they did kindly send us a video that we will share with you now. And it's basically a summary, I guess, of their speech that they were going to give us today. So hopefully that will be live with us now.
Hello, everybody. We've recorded this as we won't be with you in person later. And my name's Carl Martin. and this is Tony Garrard. We are from the New Futures Project in Leicester. So hi everybody. Basically, we're just going to tell you about the work we do. We are a charity based in Leicester City in England. We're based in the city centre more or less, and we work with adults and young people who are at risk of exploitation, sexual exploitation, could be financial exploitation, etc. And at risk of CSE and CCE, that kind of thing. And then, but we work with adults, and part of the work we do is working with street-based female sex workers in the city. But we also have women in need clients as well. So that's a brief summary of who we are and what we do. And I'm just going to get Tony to talk to you about the work we do with young people.
Hi everyone, sorry we're not there. So yeah, I'm the young person's case manager here at the project. I work with a variety of young people from different backgrounds, different upbringings with their own set of problems and needs. A lot of them come through social care, through Leicester City Social Services or county social care. We do a lot of work with kids that are being exploited and are at risk of sexual exploitation or are engaging in exploitative behaviours. A lot of them range from the ages of 12 onwards, so they're kind of in their teen years. They come to with a variety of reasons. They could be past trauma, sexual abuse, exploitation, drugs and alcohol. There's a whole range of support that we give them. We do a lot of one-to-one work with young people based on what support it is that they need. We offer in-house counselling here at the project as well, if something that they'd like to do. We can encourage that as well, but we have a wraparound kind of service. We are offering all sorts of different support. We do it based on group work as well, and on a selection of like workshops, whether that be workshops on sexual health, healthy relationships, empowerment, self-esteem, confidence building, and we do. It depends on what kind of needs that they have, and we tailor that to support them, from everything from education to employment. So yeah, that's kind of the work that we do with young people in a nutshell. But we do it. We offer them a service for as long as they need it. That could be from 1 week that they're fine, and then it can be an ongoing thing. We've had a lot of young people that are in a service for a number of years. So yeah, we're on a wraparound service for young people. We empower them to move on and go past their trauma and support them in moving forward positively with their life. So it's basically what I do.
Yeah. So yeah, and I mean my area of experience, I guess, is more with our adult street-based sex workers. That's the sort of the clients I've mostly worked with myself. I mean, in terms of this sort of topic and empowerment of women, but also in terms of it being in a high crime city. I mean, I guess something I'd say about that is that they're probably two separate questions or separate topics in a way, because for example, if we were based somewhere else, another city, or even out in a more rural area, I guess in terms of the work we do, we would probably still be working with people in the same way. So we do take a person-centered approach. We also, a lot of our work, or most, in fact, probably all of our work, is coming from a trauma-informed perspective. I mean, that's a long topic in itself, but in order to, what I would say is that if an organisation is doing trauma-informed work properly, then empowerment should be at the heart of that. So we're very much about working alongside someone for them to be kind of leading the conversation and leading the work, because ultimately it is about that person. So a lot of those methods that we use are focused on empowerment. But there are I think there's two separate things here: the high crime city and empowering people. You know, there's in some respects a lot of the work we do, I guess, is coming to us, you know, potentially as a result of crime or, you know, quite serious stuff having happened to people. So, for example, sexual assault, and we kind of, that's where we come in. So, in some respects, the work we do is as a result of result of crime. There's not, I guess, you know, we don't. There's not much that we can do about what's going on in our city. I mean, we are very aware of that. We know what I guess, you know, some of the things that go on in Leicester in relation to crime and also to assaults on women and young people. But yeah, I guess there's not a lot we can do about what's going on outside, unfortunately. I mean, you know, that comes down to the police, for example. But we do, and we do work closely with the police, particularly in terms of adult safeguarding. There's a lot of work that goes on in terms of trying to help to keep people safe when they're in risky situations. Yeah, so just trying to think what else we could say.
I mean, in terms of like the young people side of things, obviously a lot of them that come through are at risk or are being exploited. So obviously there's a lot of working together with the police on how to like map areas of where the crime is, where it's happened, so we kind of gather that information as to whereabouts this is going on and how many of the people that could potentially be involved. But yeah, we are after the fact of a crime or something being committed, to where we help these young people. So yeah, I'm not really sure much else that we could say on the kind of.
I mean, I think you would probably have some good examples of people you've worked with where the journey they've taken to feeling empowered to.
Well, yeah, there's definitely a lot of young people that I can give you examples of that we've worked with. So, young girl, 13, was being sexually exploited by a gang of older males. She was going missing. She was drinking, smoking, engaging in risky behaviours, constantly being picked up by the police. And then she had a referral here from social services, and I picked up that case. Initially, she wasn't engaging in anything. She didn't want to talk to anybody, not even a social worker, not me, not the project as a whole. But the more engagement and the more encouragement that we give, the more she was starting to open up. And then we brought her into a group work setting, and she is now, from where she was when we first started working with her, to doing all this group work of empowerment and healthy relationships and confidence building, and going to Turning Point drug and alcohol related services. And she's not been going missing. She has a stable relationship with her parents now. She's fully in full-time education. She's now become like an advocate for other young people and a role model, and helps other young girls that are going through similar situations. And she's become like the beacon of what this group is now, and how the work that we have been doing with her has changed her life dramatically. And it's moving to see that someone has gone from just being this little thing that was in such a horrible situation to now being empowered enough to know what a healthy relationship is. She's even now starting counselling. So it is nice to see, and we know that we are doing that work and actively, because we don't have this lack of engagement, we stop the work with them. We will keep the door open for that support. So I think you just have to, and young people can be quite hard to engage first off. You have to keep up that encouragement, and because they're being so used to pass from here to here and here, so many of the professionals involved in some of their care, that it's become quite overwhelming for them. But the way we work is not just a standard, you need to do this, you need to do that. We're there for every aspect of their journey. So it's really good to see that this work that we do with them is making a difference. So
Thanks, Tony. Just trying to think if there's anything else we could say. I mean, we're not in a situation, so our apologies again for not being with you, but we're not in a situation where we can kind of bounce
questions being
what
asked.
what people are saying back to us. But I mean, hopefully that gives you a rough idea of the work we do. Just trying, I mean, I'm not too sure there's anything else we can say, but thank you for inviting us onto your panel, and also thank you to the Dialogue Society for inviting us to do this. I would also say actually that I think they're quite a good example of empowering young people. Having been to some of their events and seen how they work, they actually do get young people doing quite a lot of really good things. So I'd say that's a good example in Leicester of work that's empowering for young people. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
And maybe see you sometime in the future. Bye bye.
Yeah. So even though they were unable to be with us today, I'd like to extend a very special thanks to both Carl and Tony. Also, I would like to remind everyone that unfortunately they won't be able to be with us for the Q&A, and I'm really, really sorry if anyone did have any questions for them. Just to keep the flow going and keep it moving smooth and quickly, our last panelist will be Dr. Zainab May Bornu, whose primary research focuses on inequalities, conflict, gender and development. Zainab is a lecturer in the international politics at the University of Leicester. One of her recent projects is bringing women's voices back in gender and oil conflict in the Niger Delta, I think. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing those words right, which highlights the comparative roles of women in conflict settings. So I would like to kindly pass the mic to Zainab if she's ready.
Thank you, Betul. So I'm from the University of Leicester, School of History, Politics and International Relations. My work focuses on amplifying the voices of women. And why women is because I do a lot of research in conflict-affected areas in Africa. And at the core of these issues are the women and the girls. They are always, bearing the brunt of all these issues. And it is interesting, for me, bringing the international dimension to the Leicester case, because I believe the women and young girls that are affected by, some of these, I still look at the issues, I see issues related to inequalities, I see marginalization, I see a lot of stigmatization. Why? Because there's a lot of focus, in terms of the top-down approach. Why don't we think about a bottom-up approach? And I mean, providing opportunities for some of these women, getting that trust is very, very important, both the young women and, the young girls. And I'm happy both Emma and the last speakers also spoke about this, because if you don't get that trust, they will not open up. So how do you do that? Remember, even within Leicester, in Leicestershire, there are those that are going through a lot, but they don't have the voice to speak out. If there are those that have access to communication gadgets, maybe they can engage on social platforms to be aware of some of these resources where they can get help. There are many more that don't have that. So I think my work is really more about those that are the marginalized among the marginalized, and issues to do with Africa. There's a lot of development issues, but here in Leicester, it's a different story. But like I always argue, these issues are common when we talk about exploitation, when we talk about gender-based violence, among other things. There's that problem, that culture of silence, And it goes back to sometimes the family setup, especially within the African community, the Middle Eastern community, for example. The woman is not allowed to speak out, even if she goes through some of these things. Sometimes parents look at it as a form of a degrading thing for the woman to say, maybe I have been raped, or this is happening, I'm married, but this is what is going on between my husband and I. So women in most cases are forced by the society due to cultural and religious issues, sometimes, pushing women to be silent. But I think when we talk about religion, for example, I know both about Christianity and Islam, for example, the two, these I'm very familiar with, they are against, marginalization and abusing women, for example. So issues like Emma mentioned, the issue, talking about mental health issues. Why do we see young women and girls in Leicestershire engaging in criminal activities? Why do we see some of these things? Sometimes there are issues to do with, not having that opportunity to speak out, to express yourself. And it is not about, if I walk into this center, you telling me, okay, this is how I see your issues. Why don't you engage with them, to some of these victims, some of these survivors, to, participate in some of the way you design activities in terms of them saying, maybe this is the way to go about it. I have learned, based on my work with women that, face a lot of gender-based violence and kidnapping and rape in northeastern Nigeria, for example, the women abused by Boko Haram groups, where this NGO that I worked with tried to bring, a lot of these survivors together. So sometimes the mental aspect is, the depression is, sometimes when you come to these neutral, safe spaces, you see other people that have gone through similar experiences. So, and you're able to talk. And when you talk, you want to talk to people that will understand what you're saying. And sometimes, within such communities, all it takes is for another woman with a similar lived experience to look at you, to, sometimes that smile, that look they give each other, is something that really helps. And I've come across the issues of, substance abuse. So coming back to, the Leicester example, sometimes, depression, not having that place, opportunity to, express what a woman or a girl is going through, leads, some of them into a lot of criminality. Some of them do steal, not because they really want to do that, not because they want to take so many, different substances that would affect, their natural form of thinking, but they do things that will they take substances that will help block out the pain, So these are issues that I feel are really important. Another thing is, yes, knowing where to go and accessibility is very important. But one thing I see in my work, and based on the two presentations, is what happens after the justice system? What is there for the woman? Say maybe the young woman reports, okay, this problem to an NGO, and she gets the support, through the legal system. What happens when that is over? Sometimes they go back and they're rejected by their own families, by their own communities. And sometimes you tend to see women, going back, relapsing into some of these problems. And some of them tend to just accept it, thinking, it's just the norm. This is something for me to accept. So again, going back to the issue of trust, I agree there's no one size fits all. And I do agree for more sensitization, more awareness creation. One, it is good that if we are able to work with some of these survivors and the organizations in terms of the choices available. But like I said, give them an opportunity, make it a participatory process where they will come and be a part of how we design some of these issues. Sometimes we spoke about exploitation, or those that are at the risk. Sometimes they don't even know that they are, they are at the risk of being, exploited, maybe sexually or using another form. So there is no one size fits all, but I think a lot of work needs to be done. And when I say a lot of work, especially talking about women, girls, I'm thinking of like more in terms of a collaborative approach. So I had the opportunity of screening some of my work, sharing some of my work with communities, with the public in Leicester during the Festival of Social Sciences in November last year. And these are stories I brought from Africa. But to my, amazement, I was really happy to see certain groups of women identifying with some of the words that the women are using. So I think for me as a researcher, it's a good opportunity. Now I know about Emma. Emma, I'll definitely reach out to you because I believe we have a lot to do. And also the Dialogue Society and the other organization, because I believe sometimes it is about collective efforts. I bring the lessons from my own work, I share with all of you, and maybe Emma brings Dialogue Society, because dialogue is very, very important. Again, I still feel the importance of roles played by some of the religious-based organizations like the churches, the mosques, and maybe some of the synagogues, and maybe all the religious groups that we have in the society. It is something that goes beyond religious and cultural divides. It is something that affects all, and anything that affects one woman or a girl, as far as I am concerned, affects us all, because it is very difficult for you to go to sleep sometimes. When you do research like I do, you go to the field, you see a young girl that talks to you about being raped multiple times, and they talk to you about some of them even having no access to the justice system. And even those that sometimes have, access to the justice system, sometimes they come across people, their attackers, being freed the very next day. So sometimes these are issues that do a lot in terms of the trauma, emotions, and memory that affect women and girls. And sometimes these issues tend to push people more into depression, and other psychosocial issues. Again, perhaps I'm saying a lot about women. Sometimes the young boys and young men also do face some of these issues. So here again, I think the youth also are very important. If we're able to have so many that are strong and vocal, we'll be able, I believe, to work together as a team and see how we can share lessons learned, and also come together to develop strategies, bottom-up strategies that will help us, maybe address some of these issues. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
It's very important that you all were here to obviously pass on your thoughts about this topic. So thank you so much, Zainab, again. Just a second, I'm just having a technical difficulty. So obviously, as I said, thank you so much for your input again on our topic, Zainab. And it's obviously everything that each and every one of you have said. It's very important for our topic and why we're here today. We are hopeful that today will spark some dialogue and discussion beyond today, though. So thank you for all the viewers that are here with us and for watching us. Moving on to the Q&A section of our panel, we will now start answering the questions that are going to be sent and have already been sent in our chat sections on both YouTube and on our Zoom. So if you do have other questions that you have thought of, please put them in the chat boxes now so we can direct them to whoever you want them to be answered. As I said before, Carl and Tony are unable to answer questions as they are not here with us today. But as far as I can see, Emma has a question, and you've answered it from the chat as far, yeah. So just for everyone's benefit, I'll just read the question, and if you can answer it for everyone, that'd be great. So the work you're involved in sounds so vital. Thank you so much. I was wondering if the organisations have sources in languages other than English. Leicester is a very diverse area, and at times language can be a huge barrier and impact individual confidence. So if you'd like to answer that, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So I think lots of or I would say the vast majority of organisations in Leicester really do recognise that they are delivering services to a diverse community. So they do have resources that are translated into other languages. The vast majority of them also have things like interpreter services on call if someone it doesn't have English as a first language and therefore needs support in that additional way. That said, what we do see about the individuals who work in these organisations is that they are vast majority white British, vast majority female. So in terms of the accessibility of those organisations, it might feel like that is potentially a barrier for people accessing those services, because individuals from minority communities might not feel that the issues that they want to seek support about, that the issue that they may need to ask questions about, are not going to be understood in the context of their own experiences by the workers within the organisation. So I think that is recognised by the staff within those organisations, in that they really try to have as diverse a staff group as possible. But it just seems to be that it's not always as diverse and doesn't always reflect the diversity of Leicester as much as we would want it to be.
I can add a little. I know the question was directed to you, Emma, but I think it has to do with making, the work you do and the resources available, making them legible to some of these communities. And because, well, there are those that don't really speak English, some don't understand. And I know I've come across so many across Leicester and other places. So perhaps, for example, in my own work, what I try to do is to also, if I have a report, I try my best to, translate it into Pidgin English, for example, if I'm in the Niger Delta, or another language, depending on the area that I'm working in. So I think sometimes it may be capital intensive, but trying to make some of these language is very important and a very powerful tool, especially in terms of awareness, creation, mobilizing people and sensitizing people. So perhaps, making the contents legible is very important, and being translated into some languages, depending in terms of diversity, really.
I just follow up on that, and I think that's where lived experience really comes into play, and speaking to people to ensure that it might not be that just translating something into a different language is what's needed. Maybe there is something else that alongside that translation to make that language more accessible, more supportive for those particular survivors. So I think that's where we need to talk to people from minority communities with these experiences to make sure these actually do suit their needs, that they do what organisations think they do, if that makes sense.
So as I said, we do have quite a couple of questions that are coming through at the moment. So Mr. Hacker has asked, can you ask the panelists if high crime rates discussed in the panel translates into conviction? So I'm not,
Yeah, I can start dealing with that one. I think the answer at the moment is, particularly for violence against women and girls, the answer is no. We have some real challenges with achieving conviction rates, both UK, nationally, internationally, and also within Leicester as well. And that's for a whole range of different issues. Things like we have very high levels of survivors not being able to support investigations for a whole range of different reasons. We also have a criminal justice system, and this is again across as a national issue that is very overburdened at this time. So if you think about the combination of potentially a case where a survivor isn't able to support their case by giving evidence in courtrooms, violence against women and girls is frequently in home environments, so that evidence will be the main court case evidence. So in instances where survivors are not able to support those court trial processes, that quite frequently means that those cases stop right there, so they're discontinued. That's those that we potentially link more to survivors not being able to support investigations. But then we've got things like trials that are incredibly challenging experiences for survivors. We have jurors that come with beliefs about myths and stereotypes around violence against women and girls. That means that conviction rates are incredibly small. So we have high levels being reported to the police, which are still underreported in terms of the real levels of crime in our society. But what we see is that number becoming smaller and smaller and smaller as it filters through the criminal justice process, to where we get at the end point where the data suggests around 3 to 5% conviction rates from those initial reported levels.
I can just add a little to what Emma has said, because, you know, it is about you at your argument against the other person. And sometimes the evidence, like she mentioned, is very difficult to provide. And in most cases, you know, there's that issue of fear and stigmatization. You know, these two come hand in hand. So you find out that some of these, you know, victims or survivors find it very difficult to even relive the experience over and over again. And remember, sometimes the justice system is one that is, you know, the process is really intrusive. They tend to go deep, and for some it can be very uncomfortable and very difficult. Again, another issue is the response, for example, from the police. Sometimes the time it takes for someone, you know, for you to get the attention that you deserve is something that should also, you know, that sort of, you know, hampers the, you know, conviction. And if you hear, sometimes you hear people telling you, oh, don't even bother reporting because it will take a long time, or you'll not even get that justice. So people are discouraged. So perhaps it is important for us to think about how, you know, we could work to even encourage the, you know, the justice system to improve in terms of some of these services where a woman or a young girl reports something.
Thank you so much for both of your answers for that question. So just moving on through the questions again. Another question through YouTube is, what measures are being taken to prevent the continuation of abuse? I'm guessing they're asking for something like a specific example. So it's for both of you again. So.
Absolutely. I think there is a whole range of different things that are practically being done. So it can be things like our safeguarding processes are often there in place to essentially put survivors and their families in contact with support organisations, in essence, to try and stop that abuse continuing, or those behaviours, whatever it is, continuing. I mean, obviously, the criminal justice processes, one of its key aims is, in essence, to stop abuse and stop violence occurring against women and girls. But as we've already talked about, that process is not necessarily as effective as we would want it to be. So we have situations in which, say, a case of domestic abuse, you might have the perpetrator of that abuse convicted for that offence. But for a whole range of reasons, that person who, the survivor, the victim who experienced that violence may continue a relationship with that perpetrator, or that perpetrator following whatever sentence they receive for that particular case, which could be a relatively small sentence if it's only considered to be relatively minor violence, then goes on to be violent in their next intimate relationship as well. So I think there are processes in place, but I think they don't necessarily function in a really simple and effective way that we would really want it to be. What we want really is that for those survivors, when they disclose, that there to be a really effective response that means that abuse, that violence stops. But the nature of criminal justice processes, our safeguarding processes, usually means that that's not a kind of quick and easy thing to achieve.
Just a little, I think sometimes that first response is very important. For example, who you speak to and, you know, the way that person treats you is very important, starting from the beginning. Sometimes people would want to talk to someone that looks like them or someone that is different, you know, because some will believe if I speak to someone that is different, he or she would want to listen to me. And sometimes they would prefer sometimes to talk to women because some of the discussions maybe can be quite, you know, personal. So I think these are things that are also important in terms of, you know, the safe spaces that we're talking about, because you need to get them to relax. And my experience working with gender-based, you know, violence victims and, you know, a lot of rape victims in northeastern Nigeria is that they want, you know, the fact that the organization they are working gave them an opportunity in these safe spaces to engage with women, and women that brought themselves down to their levels, you know, was one that made a difference. And sometimes the first person you even talk to is someone that has the same lived experience. So rather than trying to break some of the details down, you're talking to someone that understands really what you're talking about. So I think that first, you know, contact, the person attitude towards you is very important. So if women get the opportunity, or young girls, to engage with someone that brings himself down to your level, that makes you feel relaxed, that looks at you like a human being, not like someone that will not just show that pity immediately, but someone that will treat you as, you know, as a friend, as a sister. I think that is something that is important.
Thank you so much for the answers. So the next question that we got was in the Zoom chat again from Andrea Wilson. So the question is, which organizations or groups of people do you feel could get involved in raising awareness of services, and what barriers are preventing them getting involved so far? Would you like to answer this for us, Zainab?
My experience is there are so many psychosocial mental health groups, and I know there are so many women organizations. There are youth-based organizations that are doing a lot. But most importantly, it has to do a lot of, you know, a lot of requirements regarding finances, right? For you to do sensitization, awareness campaigns, you need the resources. So funding is a major thing to consider. If you don't have the resources, you won't be able to engage, especially those, you know, the hard to reach victims that we're talking about. Remember, it's not a one size fit all. It's not a case where people are able to engage on the same platform. Some have access to social media. There are the majority that have no access to some of these. So I think funding and access to some of these groups that will be able to reach deep into some of these societies and groups to talk with people.
Is there anything I was going to say, is there anything you'd like to add on?
I was just going to say about mainstreaming conversations about this much more. So we know that talking about things around kind of sex, domestic abuse, all of those things are really awkward for us in society. We know that, you know, we just don't talk about these things, that we hide away from them. But I think pretty much all community group, faith groups, wherever people congregate as a group, I think would benefit from just being more open to talking about these kind of conversations, thinking about these things early on. So within schools, is there a place for having conversations, not necessarily immediately about violence, but about healthy relationships? And there's lots of work going on with schools now that is starting to try and develop those conversations really early on. So I think the thing that I would add is just trying not to shy away from these issues so much, and trying, because that reduces the stigma, it reduces the silences around victimization. So I think it's something as a society as a whole we could take responsibility for shining a light on, and not being so awkward about having these conversations.
Can I quickly add also, apart from the schools, the home is very important. Parents should be accessible, you know, to their children. Their children should be able to talk freely to maybe a mother, or maybe a sister, or maybe someone within. Sometimes it could even be the father, but sometimes you find that parents make it very difficult for their children, you know, especially the younger ones, to talk. You want to talk, but sometimes they shut you up, or quickly you're told, you know, these are issues we're not supposed to talk about. No, don't talk about some of these things. So sometimes if you are deprived of such an opportunity, it is one that some of them tend to go elsewhere, you know, to get some of these forms of support that they're looking for. Yes, I agree the schools are doing a lot, and really they're doing a lot, because I've had, you know, a course to engage with some teachers in some of these schools talking about these issues. But the home is very important. The school, they're there for certain hours, but most of the time they're at home, you know, so they should be able to talk. So parenting, I think, is a very important thing to talk about.
And I will shut up in a minute, but just to add on for what Zainab said as well, about if we don't have these conversations, we know that young people and adults go to other sources. So thinking about things around social media, there's been lots of conversations around people like Andrew Tate and the very negative way in which they talk about using women, about the way in which women should be treated. So we need to have conversations here, because we know that young people go to those sources and use them as and accept them as sources that they should follow and you know, treat as authoritative. So I think that speaks to that importance about families having conversations and everyone else having these conversations, so that we can have them reflect the reality of this situation.
Yeah, so it should be an open topic for parents to be able to talk with their children, so they are more aware of it as well, which is really important. So another question that we got from someone anonymous, apparently, that's really cute. Like, there's anonymous people in here. But what would you recommend for women and girls to protect from? So what would you recommend for women and girls to protect from any kind of abuse? So to protect themselves from any kind of abuse. It's for both of you, so anyone can start if they've got an answer to this question.
I think that's quite a hard one to actually start, in terms of thinking about what they could protect themselves from. I think certainly there's parts of that around education. So sometimes we see that victims don't actually understand that the behaviours that they're experiencing are actually victimisation. So it's things like consent to sexual relationships, that consent is not implicit if you are married between husbands and wives. consent is not enduring, it is something that is negotiated each time. So people think that they need to submit to sexual relationships with their husband because of traditions around culture and things like that. So I think there's things around that women can help protect themselves against by knowing and understanding what behaviours are acceptable. And similarly, things like controlling behaviours within domestic abuse, understanding what is acceptable behaviour and where that boundary is towards those behaviours then becoming coercive and controlling. So I think there's something there around protection. We also know that things like having a very strong social network around you can be hugely protective for women, because of just that simple thing that if you have someone who you can talk to who is very supportive of you, that is normally a very positive thing in women's worlds in terms of a whole range of different things. But particularly we see in violence against women and girls that recovery does a lot better after victimisation if they have a strong social network, but also they're much more able to engage in help seeking when they have a strong social network. So I think those are the things I think about. I don't know, Zainab, whether you could add anything to that?
I think it's also to know that it is okay to say no and being aware of where to go in your local community. You should be able, and to understand that it is okay to speak out when such things happen. These are not things that you should keep to yourself, to yourself. If you're able to speak out, that will be the first step in terms of getting help, as against bottling up the emotions. And then sometimes these lead to depression, especially if they're happening, constantly. Sometimes, you see, like I mentioned earlier, people taking one substance or another just to, numb that pain, just to block it out.
Yeah, that was a really hard question. Like just reading it was really hard as well, can't lie. So this is another question from Kate Stewart. So how do you reach domestic violence survivors to ask them about their lived experiences? Because obviously it would be really hard because it would be some type of trauma for them. So obviously you'd have a better way of getting in touch with them. So if you'd give us examples, that would be great.
Am I okay? I don't want to trample over you, Zainab. Do you want to take this one first? Or
you can go ahead, I'll go after you.
Yeah, no worries. I'll talk all day, honestly. So the vast majority of my research when I do work with survivors, we usually access them through a support agency that they're already engaging with. And the reason why we do that is around safety. So we know that if someone engages in research with us, that they already have really strong care and support wrapped around them. We're obviously incredibly careful when we do our research because we don't want to re-victimize someone. We don't want to worsen any experiences of trauma. But by its very nature, when participants do sometimes participate in research, it can raise adverse effects. So that's the normal way in which I would access survivors, because you do get that care and support that they can fall back on if there is any issues that come post victimization, post participating. That does affect the representativeness of our findings to a certain extent, because we don't always manage to hear those hidden voices in communities, because these are going to be people who have not disclosed to anyone. And so their experiences may be very different from someone who is already engaged in services. But there's always a balance there between the safety of the participant and the representative of your findings. And I think we always go with an approach that emphasizes safety. We wouldn't ever want to not injure someone, but cause more trauma for someone who doesn't have wraparound care and support in place already.
Also, just to add a little to that, like the research ethics, are very, very, very important. You know, safety, confidentiality also very important. And there are times when, for me in my work, apart from some of the organizations I work with, my work has had this snowballing effect in terms of when I engage with a certain group in a community, others tend to find out. And because I'm always accessible to some of these groups that I work with, it's not about going to do research and disappearing. I always engage with them continuously, and I have the opportunity of getting, some of the very shy ones reaching out to me saying, I want to discuss with you, but I want to see you alone, or maybe they will tell me how they want to engage with me, and I try my best to make myself available. And it has to do with, if you take yourself down to their own level, of course, bearing in mind the ethics and the approval, the consent that you get from them. There are times, you come across, when they're talking, it gets really emotional. You have to stop that interview right there and then, and maybe try and get the necessary support you can to calm the person down. But there are those that, even though they break down, they want to continue. They want to tell you their story. And if you're able to go down to their level, to engage with them. For me, I go to them as a woman, as a mother also, and because if I work in Nigeria, I go to them as a Nigerian. So we engage, some of them selling foodstuffs, foodstuffs, we talk, we joke, we engage, we discuss different things before we get down to the business of the day. Sometimes you come across, people that tend to give you much more than you bargain for. And this is something that has happened to me. I have a lot of data, a lot I'm not going to use because some of them are quite graphic and emotional. So for things like that, I don't use. And even what I use, I always get their permission. Do you think it's okay for me to talk about this that you said? How do you want to, to be represented? And because I use participatory and visual methodologies depending on the nature of my research. So this is something that comes into play. So going down to them, getting that trust is one that opens up a lot. And the gatekeepers that you meet are very, very important. For me, I maintain the relationship. I don't forget them.
Yeah, so carrying on with the questions, I have no idea how much time we have, by the way, just to let you know. So if I do cut off like an answer, or if we don't get around to every question, then I'm so sorry. So we have a question for Emma. It says, when using lived experiences, do they receive any, well, you've kind of answered that. So yeah, I think we've answered that because it says, when using lived experiences, do they receive any support? So you did say that they receive support after obviously participating, and obviously before you would see if they're comfortable with everything. So that's so I'm just trying to look through the questions as we're going along, so sorry. So Taiba Hussein has asked, what causes perpetrators to be perpetrators, and how can we tackle this? It is a question for both of you, so whoever feels comfortable to start can take the mic. Do you want to...
Shall I get started? We know quite a lot around developmental pathways to engaging in criminal behaviours, and these tend to be a whole range of different things that can occur in childhood. It can be adverse life experiences for the perpetrators themselves. It can be negative family experiences as they grow up. It can be abuse themselves. It can be things like poverty. It can be poor engagement in education. It can be things like personality disorders or mental health disorders. It is really incredibly multifaceted, and that means intervening in those behaviours is incredibly challenging. So there is a whole range of different perpetrator interventions that are available, both within kind of prisons, if the sentence is serious enough to merit a prison sentence, but also delivered within the communities as well. And we have examples of organisations working with Empower who work specifically with perpetrators of violence who are currently in communities, and work very successfully with them. So intervention and successful intervention is possible, but it is incredibly challenging given the multifaceted reasons that explain why people engage in violence.
So some perpetrators don't even know that what they're doing is wrong, depending on their own lived experience also. So I think it still goes back to education, at the, formal education level, and also going back to the family. Sometimes the way you see a father or male members of the family treating women or even the girls, these sometimes play a lot. And some of these perpetrators do what they do based on their own experience. Maybe they wanted to have very close relationships with their mothers, for example, but not having. Sometimes it's that anger that people use, as against others. There are people that don't regard women as anything. I've come across so many. I know one that said to me, in my experience, in my, my life, a woman is nothing. So I never saw my father treat any woman with respect. So this is just the harsh reality. Some don't even know what they're doing it is wrong, but there are some that know and they do it, deliberately just to exploit. But I think a lot needs, goes back to the family being the first, level of education that every child gets, then going to the formal setting, and then, engagement with people in the community also.
Yeah. Again, thank you for your answers on that question. So one of the other questions that we got from someone anonymous is, how can we approach those who are still experiencing violence but don't have the courage to ask for help? So Zainab, do you want to start answering this one?
Yes, so such a group, need a lot of persuasion. One has to do with trust. So that awareness, that sensitization that will be done at different levels. So it should be a bottom-up approach. Sometimes you can pass it through the word of mouth, okay? Maybe friends talking about, I know about this organization that is safe. You can go, you can talk to them, do this or do that. If it is very difficult, that, there is that fear. Fear is a very powerful thing. Some are scared. If I go, I open up. Maybe they will go back, they will tell my parents, or maybe they will tell my husband, or they will tell my community. We see so many cases now, women being forced, suppressed into domestic life. We hear about honor killings, for example. These things are true, they are happening. But then sometimes we follow the justice system. Sometimes these people that want to speak out are interested in seeing, okay, maybe this person reported her own case, but what is happening even after the woman is killed? What happens after that? So these are issues that are very important, but a lot of sensitization, awareness needs to be done, just so that, and when we do some of these activities, you need to break it down, you need to make it legible to them. So again, going back to the use of language that I remember someone asked, reach out, use different mediums. Not everyone has technology, but sometimes that word of mouth, if someone understands using the language, he or she will be able to pass on the information and to get the support. And when they come, I think that first impression, that first approach is very, very important.
And I would just add to that they might not necessarily have the courage now, but it's about giving them information, giving choices, raising that awareness, and then perhaps leaving them to think about things, consider things, and then think about what is right for them for the future. So we always talk quite a bit about survivors, about things very rarely work in a lovely linear way. So you'd kind of like to know that, oh, you know someone who's experiencing violence, oh, we're going to stop that violence, and then they're going to support a criminal justice process, and it's all going to work in a very linear way in which they recover, get justice for what happens to them. But in practice, that rarely really happens, and women who experience violence quite often go round in circles frequently. Sometimes they'll engage with police, sometimes they won't, sometimes they've disclosed, sometimes they won't. So I think it's just providing support and providing choice, providing information, raising that awareness, and supporting that person in the choices that they make when they are ready to make those choices. And just recognizing that they need to lead this, they need to feel empowered to do this, and that it's not necessarily always what you might think is logical that someone would want to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. So as I said, we do have quite a couple of questions left, and apparently we do need to end towards 5, so I'm just gonna whiz through them. So this is a question for Dr. Sleath from Sharfa Jahan. You mentioned that during the pandemic, survivors were able to access services remotely. Are these services still being offered online? And are you aware of any issues with women and girls who were or are unable to access these online resources because they don't or didn't have the technical equipment like laptops and mobiles?
Yeah, so we know that the vast majority of organisations have returned back to a more kind of face-to-face approach, which is why we're kind of, as part of our projects, trying to highlight that benefits were received in some respects for these online services, so that we don't lose that really good learning. But yeah, the vast majority return to face-to-face. There might be individual situations in which those services are still being delivered online, but very much return back to what we might want to consider normal. And I think that comes down to some of the access issues that people did experience. So simple things like digital poverty is something that women experience, which means that not everyone has access to reliable phone technology, reliable internet access. So if you're going to offer services in that way, some women are not going to be able to engage in those services due to, like I said, digital poverty, not having access to those online services. So yeah, it is a barrier.
It is a huge barrier in a lot of different aspects and institutions, to be honest. Like education, it was online for the past 2 years, and a lot of students did end up failing their exams because it wasn't as good as face-to-face, but obviously it wasn't accessible to them as well.
And that disproportionately affects minority communities.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So it specifically impacts on communities that we'd want to engage, that we want to facilitate engagement as much as possible.
So another question, another question that we have is, so this one's for both of you again. Do you think the most of the victims have enough courage to report what they are living through, or we can only realize the issues that have been raised? Was that question clear? I don't know. So it says, so I'm going to try rewording it so it's more understandable. So do you think most of the victims have enough courage to report what they are going through, or do we only realize the issues that have been raised? That makes more sense now.
I think for me, the majority don't have the courage to report. And sometimes even those that speak out, they tend to be selective in terms of what they're going to say. So no, the majority don't have the courage, and a lot needs to be done, in terms of building that courage in people, in women, to understand that it is okay to go and speak, and when you go, you can get the support, the protection that you need. It should be an opportunity where if you go, you want to be, maybe kept in a safe environment. You should be able to have that in order for you to be open to speak out. Emma, I don't know.
Completely agree. I think there's really high levels of underreporting. So, we draw on statistics, our official statistics, like police recorded crime, like the crime survey in England and Wales, to try and capture the levels of victimisation in our society. But some, particularly around things like sexual violence, some researchers estimate that they only really represent around 25% of victimisation that actually occurs in our societies. So when you talk about Leicester being potentially a high crime city, that those statistics are still going to be an underrepresentation of the levels of actual victimisation that are occurring in our community.
Yeah, that's very true. Obviously, not everyone has the courage and not everyone has the resources to be able to get across to someone. So the ones that are in the statistics and that we can report and that have been reported are only from the people that are aware of what's going on and what's happening to them and actually have the courage to stand up for themselves. So another question that we have from Bina Solanki. So if conversations are good with parents and family, but their general question is, what about if this conversation links to honour-based violence, so honour killing? Who would like to go first on this one?
I think that's a really hard one to answer, really. We're talking, when we talk about kind of family education, we're talking about that being a supportive, kind of warm environment in which families can have conversations. But I think if we're going to reflect the entirety of violence against women and girls, that is not the case for some women, if we're going to talk about things like honour killings. So I don't think there's particularly a conversation that would be had within the family in that situation, but that would be thinking about where potentially faith leaders can really speak out in their communities to highlight this issue, and that it is one that shouldn't be acceptable within communities.
Yes, I do agree with this, because it is a very difficult subject, but I think, like Emma mentioned, the faith-based leaders, religious leaders, have a lot to do in terms of, raising more awareness about, this, the honor killings and among other things. Because if they're able to discuss, for example, to preach or to discuss using maybe the Bible or the Quran, for example, and cite, very strong, depending on, we call it tafsir, where, the verse is translated and then it is broken down, and using current examples for people to understand. I think this is something that will play a very big role. But without the support of faith-based leaders, I don't see, discussions about, honor killings being successful, because these are things, it's about culture and tradition being mixed. And sometimes people bring in religion, but really, it's not about religion. It's about culture and tradition, about that woman's place, the woman's place at the home front being, to be a yes person. The woman is supposed to be seen and heard and to do what, the parents, the family wants her to do, or the girl. So I think these are important issues, but it goes back to culture and tradition. And I think community leaders will play a very big role, but most especially religious-based people. They have to do a lot in terms of this.
Yeah, it can obviously everyone's norms and values are different from depending on where they come from. So it does look at changing those norms for them to be able to stop something like that, obviously, in my opinion. We do only have 15 minutes left. So I would personally like to ask the last question. So I had written it down somewhere, so I'm just going to pull that up if you just give me a second. So obviously, just to wrap up the discussion, a final question is, what do you think is the best step an ally can do to help combat violence against women in Leicester? So what can we do, or what can any of the other charities and other sport agencies, what do you think they can do to be able to combat violence against women in Leicester?
Okay.
Go for it, Zainab.
There's a lot to be done. Most importantly, it has to do with their voices. Their voices need to be heard. The woman or the young girl should be given the opportunity to voice out, so that if she's able to voice out, it will perhaps stop her from going, pushing her to go and do something wrong. And also it has to do with empowerment, with options, for example, available. Sometimes you see women and young girls applying for jobs and they're not successful. Sometimes if pregnancy is an issue for some organizations, they don't really want to employ women in childbearing age so that they will not be going for maternity leaves, among other things. So it has to do with options and choices available for some of these people, to show them if you don't get this, there's another option. For example, you can do in terms of volunteering, among other things. But it should be an opportunity where the platform should be one where they'll be able to engage, to be able to have their voices heard. And sometimes if they have these opportunities, they will be able to go back and share, some of these lessons with their group of friends, or sometimes at the family level. But I think most importantly for me is about the voices being recognized and heard, and listened to, with actions that follow some of these voices.
And I think some of those things is that the support organisations that we have in Leicester that do amazing work need more sustainable funding, more longer term funding to help support survivors to have their voices heard, if that makes sense. They do great work, but many of these organisations are overburdened with high numbers of survivors needing care and support. So I think that kind of solution comes from a slightly higher level. It's where our commissioners are, where kind of our local government funding is coming from. And if that provides more resources to organisations, these organisations can support survivors much more effectively and enable them to make positive choices towards their empowerment. So it always comes down to a bit of money, really, in the end, which is not easy to find in these days.
Yeah, it's really hard to get sustainable funds for small charities that are trying to do things like this, because obviously more professionals are working in larger charities, and they obviously have larger groups that are applying for funds and grants, so they actually get more funding and they get it quicker than other small charities and other CSIs that are trying to do things like this, which is really sad, to be honest, because every work counts and every courage that comes out from any women that stand up for themselves counts along this journey. So coming up to the end of our panel and our live stream, I'm so sorry for any questions that have not been able to be answered, because we do have limited time, and this is honestly really sad that we can't answer all of them, because all of the questions, I've been reading through them and they actually touch onto really good points and really important aspects of what we were talking about today. And I'd just like to say most of our audience have typed in their thanks regarding your presence here today. And on behalf of Dialogue Society, I really want to thank you guys so much for joining us and talking to us about the really important aspect and the reason why we were here today. Just a second, I'm so sorry. So yeah, unfortunately, we have to come to an end for today's panel discussion. I'm so sorry. Unfortunately, we have to come to an end of today's panel discussion. We again thank you to our very valuable panelists that were here with us today, and thank you so much to all our audience watching from a load of different platforms, as far as I'm aware. And I would like to especially thank Feride from our Young Dialogue Society platform for putting this event together for us, and everyone else that has helped along the way. We would also like to thank the United Nations Commissions on the status of women for facilitating this forum where these kinds of discussions can be held. We hope that today's event was able to make a change and will allow us to build a safer and more secure community for women in Leicestershire and all around the world from where everyone is watching. So I hope it sparked an inspiration for anyone that was watching us here today. Just a little note, if you would like to follow any of our panelists on their social medias and Dialogue Society and get in touch with us about any of the projects that we are doing and any ongoing projects or any projects that may begin for both Emma, Zainab and Dialogue Society, our social media accounts will be linked on here. We should have someone doing it in a second. So our social media accounts will be on here. If you would like to be able to get in touch with Zainab or Emma, you can obviously contact us because I'm not sure if their links are going to be on there, but we are willing to forward any information that we are allowed to regarding Emma and Zainab's contact information. And just as a last note, please follow us on all our social media platforms, including Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, as far as I'm aware, YouTube, where we were streaming today. And again, it was really nice to meeting you both personally, and thank you for everyone for watching us today. Is there anything you guys would like to add?
Just to say thank you very much. Thank you very much for sending in some really interesting questions. It's been brilliant to have a conversation about these issues.
To echo what has been said, thank you very much, and happy to engage beyond this forum because I believe we need to start talking. We need to, work together. So happy to engage, and I'm sure Dialogue Society will be happy to share my email address. You can always look me up at the University of Leicester anyway and get my email address. Thank you.
Yeah.